So please welcome Jane Whitledge. How is this?
Thank you for being here. My talk today is titled Thomas Paine, Freethinking Founder of Our Country. Paine, the great American genius, was, like many other great men and women, self-taught. He was a man of ideas. Most people know him for his words, "These are the times that try men's souls." And they may well have seen the quote on, say, a bumper sticker, "The world is my country, and to do good is my religion." Not all people know, however, that Thomas Paine is credited with our victory over England in the Revolutionary War. Benjamin Franklin wrote to him, "You, Thomas Paine, are more responsible than any other living person on this continent for the creation of what are called the United States of America." Paine wrote the country's first bestseller, the pamphlet Common Sense, that became an overnight sensation, rousing the colonists to fight for their freedom. And his crisis pamphlets, during the hardest times of the war, when independence seemed all but lost, stirred the soldiers and gathered hundreds of new recruits to the cause. He could have become rich from all of his writings, except with his Common Sense pamphlet, he gave the proceeds to buy mittens for Washington's troops. He deliberately priced his pamphlets very cheaply so all could afford to buy them. Thomas Paine was born on January 29, 1737 in Thetford, England, a small town about 90 miles northeast of London. His father was a poor corset maker and a Quaker. His mother was a member of the Church of England. But in adulthood, Paine declared himself a deist. He believed in God, just not the God of the Orthodox religions. Nearly all the founders were deists, and as well as Abraham Lincoln coming many years after him. At the end of Paine's life, he would become hated and scorned by the very people he saved. He would find himself friendless and die a lonely death, turned away even from the Quaker graveyard where he had asked to be buried. This because he took on the church and the Bible with his book, The Age of Reason, written during the French Revolution. I had intended for today to write a talk on the details of Paine's life. The life is so full. But in the process, lost in a volume of notes, my mind whirling from it all, I reread Robert Ingersoll's 19th century lecture on Thomas Paine, and I realized I could do no better. Besides, Ingersoll deserves this rereading. He, the second most famous freethinker in America, besides Paine, with this lecture, restored Paine's reputation in America and his importance. Single-handedly, Robert Ingersoll did this, laying out Paine's accomplishments and shaming the country for its neglect of this great patriot and humane man. I have abridged the lecture for time consideration. So, Robert Ingersoll's Thomas Paine, written in 1870. I feel indebted to Thomas Paine for the liberty we are enjoying this day. Born among the poor in a country where real liberty was unknown, where the privileges of class were guarded with infinite jealousy, and the rights of the individual trampled beneath the feet of priests and nobles, where to advocate justice was treason, where intellectual freedom was infidelity. It is wonderful that the idea of liberty ever entered his brain. He had more brains than books, more sense than education, more courage than politeness, more strength than polish. He had no veneration for old mistakes, no admiration for ancient lies. He loved the truth for the truth's sake and for man's sake. He saw oppression on every hand, injustice everywhere, hypocrisy at the altar, venality on the bench, tyranny on the throne. And with a splendid courage, he espoused the cause of the weak against the strong, of the enslaved against the titled few. In England, he was nothing. He belonged to the lower classes. There was no avenue open for him. The people hugged their chains, and the whole power of the government was ready to crush any man who endeavored to strike a blow for the right. At the age of 37, Thomas Paine left England for America with the hope of being instrumental in the establishment of a free government. In his own country, he could accomplish nothing. Those two vultures, church and state, were ready to tear to pieces and devour the heart of anyone who might deny their divine right to enslave the world. Paine gave to the world his common sense. It was the first argument for separation, the first assault upon the British form of government, the first blow for a republic, and it aroused our fathers like a trumpet blast. No other pamphlet ever accomplished such wonderful results. It was filled with argument, reason, persuasion, and unanswerable logic. It opened a new world. It filled the present with hope. Everywhere the people responded, and in a few months the Continental Congress declared the colonies free and independent states. A new nation was born. It is simple justice to say that Paine did more to cause the Declaration of Independence than any other man. In my judgment, Ingersoll writes, Thomas Paine was the best political writer that ever lived. Ceremony, pageantry, and all the paraphernalia of power had no effect upon him. He examined into the why and wherefore of things. He was perfectly radical in his mode of thought. Nothing short of the bedrock satisfied him. During all the dark scenes of the Revolution, never for one moment did he despair. Paine was not content with having aroused the spirit of independence, but he gave every energy of his soul to keep that spirit alive. He was with the army. He shared its defeats, its danger, and its glory. When the situation became desperate, when gloom settled upon all, he gave them the crisis pamphlets. He shouted to them, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." And here I'd like to digress because I just love the story of Paine writing the first crisis pamphlet. Paine has signed up with the army. He's no soldier. Maybe it has something to do with his Quaker background, who knows. So a general appoints him as his aide. By now the war is going very badly and things are desperate. Washington needs a victory. He's in retreat. Independence is hanging by a thread. Washington is leading his troops westward in a driving rain, cold, wind. Uniforms are threadbare. Some of the soldiers are barefoot. Their boots have worn out. Everyday soldiers are deserting, sometimes whole companies. Washington halts his army on the shores of the Delaware River. Paine reaches Washington's camp, and the two eventually meet. Washington had really admired Paine's common sense pamphlet earlier in the year. Now, General Washington tells Paine that he needs his pen more than his musket. He needs Paine to write something to restore confidence, to convince the troops and the American people that their cause is worth fighting for. So Paine sets to work right away. He writes by a campfire on a drumhead near General Greene's tent. When he's almost finished writing, he walks 35 miles to Philadelphia, all along the way being afraid he'll be discovered by the redcoats. By now everybody knows he's written common sense, and if he is arrested, it is sure gallows for him. So he gets to Philadelphia. Congress and thousands of citizens have fled in terror, panicking, pledging their loyalty to King George. They're sure they're going to lose the war. Paine stays and polishes his pamphlet and gets it ready for the publisher. Just before Christmas Eve, the pamphlet reaches George Washington. It's exactly what he needs. In the moonlight, the army waits. Washington has his officers read the American crisis to the soldiers. Writer Albert Merrin writes, "Paine's words went to the soldiers' hearts like fiery arrows. Ragged men, many with tears rolling down their cheeks, looked at one another in silent agreement. Nobody could call them summer soldiers and sunshine patriots." unquote. By December 26, Washington has crossed the Delaware and secured his victory. The pamphlet does even better than Common Sense, and hundreds of new recruits flood into the Army. Ingersoll writes, "To those who wish to put the war off to some future day," he said, "every generous parent should say, if there must be a war, let it be in my day, that my child may have peace." To the cry that Americans were rebels, he replied, "He that rebels against treason is a real rebel, but he that in the defense of reason rebels against tyranny has a better title to defender of the faith than George the Third. Some said it was not in the interest of the colonies to be free. Paine answered, "To know whether it be the interest of the continent to be independent, we need ask only this simple question: is it the interest of a man to be a boy all his life?" He found many who would listen to him, to nothing, and to them he said that to argue with a man who has renounced his reason is like giving medicine to the dead. The writings of Paine fairly glitter with simple, compact, logical statements that carry conviction to the dullest and most prejudiced. He had the happiest possible way of putting things, in asking questions in such a way that they answer themselves. Day and night he labored for America, month after month, year after year. After year, he gave himself to the great cause until there was a government of the people and for the people, a continent consecrated to the happiness of mankind. At the close of the Revolution, no one stood higher in America than Thomas Paine. The best, the wisest, the most patriotic were his friends and admirers, and had he been thinking only of his own good, he might have rested from his toils and spent the remainder of his life in comfort and ease. He could have been what the world calls respectable. He could have died surrounded by clergymen, warriors, and statesmen. At his death, there would have been an imposing funeral, miles of carriage, salvos of artillery, a nation in mourning. He chose rather to benefit mankind. At that time, the seeds sown by the great infidels were beginning to bear fruit in France. The people were beginning to think. On every hand, science was bearing testimony against the church. Voltaire had filled Europe with light. The encyclopedists had attacked superstition with information for the masses. The foundation of things began to be examined. Miracles began to get scarce. Everywhere the people began to inquire. The word liberty was in the mouth of the people, and they began to wipe the dust from their knees. Thomas Paine went to France. Into the new movement he threw all his energies. His fame had gone before him, and he was welcomed as a friend of the human race, a champion for free government. He published his greatest political work, The Rights of Man. It is concise, accurate, natural, convincing, and unanswerable. The most difficult political problems are solved with a few sentences. The fears of the administration were aroused, and Paine was persecuted for libel and found guilty, and yet there is not a sentiment in the entire work that will not challenge the admiration of every civilized person. It is political wisdom, an arsenal ideas, and an honor to human nature itself. It could have been written only by the man who had the generosity, the exalted patriotism, the goodness to say, "The world is my country, and to do good my religion." In 1792, Paine was elected by the Department of Calais as their representative in the National Assembly. So great was his popularity that he was selected about the same time by the people of no less than 4 departments. Upon taking his place in the Assembly, he was appointed as one of the committee to draft a constitution for France. Had the French people taken the advice of Thomas Paine, there would have been no reign of terror. The streets of Paris would have been filled with blood. The revolution would have been the grandest success of the world. The truth is that Paine was too conservative to suit the leaders of the French Revolution. They, to a great extent, were carried away by hatred and a desire to destroy. They had suffered so long, they had borne so much, that it was impossible for them to be moderate in the hour of victory. Besides all this, the French people had been so robbed by the government, so degraded by the church, that they were not fit material with which to construct a republic. Many of the leaders longed to establish a beneficent and just government, but the people asked for revenge. Paine was filled with a real love for mankind. His philanthropy was boundless. He wished to destroy monarchy, not the monarch. He voted for the destruction of tyranny and against the death of the king. In the assembly where nearly all were demanding the execution of the king, where to differ from the majority was to be suspected, and where to be suspected was almost certain death, Thomas Paine had the courage, the goodness, and the justice to vote against death. To vote against the execution of the king was a vote against his own life. For this, he was arrested, imprisoned, and doomed to death. You will find but few sublimer acts than that of Thomas Paine voting against the king's death. He, the hater of despotism, the abhorrer of monarchy, the champion of the rights of man, accepting death to save the life of a deposed tyrant, of a throneless king. This was the last grand act of his political life, the sublime conclusion to his political career. Had his enemies succeeded in bringing him to the block, he would have escaped the calumnies and the hatred of the Christian world. In this country, at least, he would have been ranked with the proudest names. In this country, he would have ranked with the proudest of names. On the anniversary of the Declaration, his name would have been upon the lips of all the orators, and his memory in the hearts of all people. Thomas Paine had not finished his career. He had spent his life thus far in destroying the power of kings, and now he turned his attention to the priests. He knew that every abuse had been embalmed in Scripture, that every outrage was in partnership with some holy text. He knew that the throne skulked behind the altar and both behind a pretended revelation from God. He had explored the foundations of despotism and had found them infinitely rotten. He had dug under the throne, and it occurred to him that he would take a look behind the altar. The result of his investigation was given to the world in the Age of Reason. From the moment of its publication, he became infamous. He was calumniated beyond measure. To slander him was to secure the thanks of the church. All his services were instantly forgotten, disparaged, or denied. He was shunned as though he had been a pestilence. Most of his old friends forsook him, and at the bare mention of his name, the bloody hands of the church were raised in horror. He was denounced as the most despicable of men. Not content with following him to his grave, they pursued him after death with redoubled fury and recounted with infinite gusto and satisfaction the supposed horrors of his deathbed, gloried in the fact that he was forlorn and friendless, and gloated like fiends over what they supposed to be the agonizing remorse of his lonely death. It is wonderful that all his services were thus forgotten. It is amazing that one kind word did not fall from some pulpit, that someone did not accord him at least honesty. Strange that in the general denunciation, someone did not remember his labor for liberty, his devotion to principle, his zeal for the rights of his fellow human beings. He was one of the creatures of light, one of the heralds of the dawn. He hated tyranny in the name of kings and in the name of God with every drop of his blood. In all ages, reason has been regarded as the enemy of religion. Nothing has been considered so pleasing to the deity as a total denial of the authority of your own mind. Self-reliance has been thought a deadly sin, and the idea of living and dying without the aid and consolation of superstition has always horrified the church. To practice justice, to love mercy is not enough. You must believe in some incomprehensible creed. The man who practiced every virtue but failed to believe was execrated. Nothing so outrages the feelings of the church as a moral unbeliever. Nothing so horrible as a charitable atheist. When Paine was born, the world was religious, the pulpit was the real throne, and the churches were making every effort to crush out of the brain the idea that it had the right to think. He examined the scriptures for himself and found them filled with cruelty, absurdity, and immorality. He commenced with the assertion that any system of religion that has anything in it that shocks the mind of a child cannot be a true system. What a beautiful, what a tender sentiment. No wonder the church began to hate him. He believed in one God and no more. After this life, he hoped for happiness. He believed that true religion consisted in doing justice, loving mercy, in endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy, and in offering to God the fruit of the heart. He denied the inspiration of the scriptures. This was his crime. He contended that it is a contradiction in terms to call anything a revelation that comes to us secondhand, either verbally or in writing. He asserted that revelation is necessarily limited to the first communication, and that after that it is only an account of something which another person says was a revelation to him. He denied the divine origin of Christ and showed conclusively that the pretended prophecies of the Old Testament had no reference to him whatever. And yet he believed that Christ was a virtuous and amiable man, that the morality he taught and practiced was of the most benevolent and elevated character. Upon this point, he matched the sentiments now held by the Unitarians, and in fact by all the most enlightened Christians. In his time, the church believed and taught that every word of the Bible was absolutely true. Since his day, it has been proven false in its cosmogony, false in its astronomy, false in its chronology, false in its history, and so far as the Old Testament is concerned, false in almost everything. There are but few, if any, scientific men who apprehend that the Bible is literally true. Who on earth at this day would pretend to settle any scientific question by a text from the Bible? The church itself will be driven to occupy the position of Thomas Paine. You are no longer asked to swallow the Bible whole, whale, Jonah, and all. These follies have passed away, and the only reason that the religious world can now have for disliking Paine is that they have been forced to adopt so many of his opinions. Ingersoll continues, Paine thought the barbarities of the Old Testament inconsistent with what he deemed the real character of God. He believed that murder, massacre, and indiscriminate slaughter had never been commanded by a deity. He regarded much of the Bible as childish, unimportant, and foolish. Paine attacked the Bible precisely in the same spirit in which he attacked the pretensions of kings. He used the same weapons. All the pomp in the world could not make him cower. His reason knew no holy of holies except the abode of truth. The church, though, was all-powerful, and no one thought for a moment of disputing the fundamental doctrines of Christianity. The infamous doctrines that salvation depends upon belief, upon a mere intellectual conviction, was then believed and preached. To doubt was to secure the damnation of your soul. This absurd and devilish doctrine shocked the common sense of Thomas Paine, and he denounced it with the fervor of honest indignation. This doctrine, although infinitely ridiculous, has been nearly universal and has been as hurtful as senseless. For the overthrow of this infamous tenet, Paine exerted all his strength. The combined wisdom and genius of all mankind cannot possibly conceive of an argument against liberty of thought. Neither can they show why anyone should be punished, either in this world or another, for acting honestly in accordance with reason, and yet this doctrine is believed and defended by the entire Orthodox world. Can it be possible that we have been endowed with reason, simply that our souls may be caught in its toils and snares, that we may be led by its false and delusive glare out of the narrow path that leads to joy into the broad way of everlasting death? Ought the sailor to throw away his compass and depend entirely on the fog? If reason can determine what is merciful, what is just, the duties of man to man, what more do we want, either in time or eternity? The Christianity of Paine's day is not the Christianity of our time. There has been a great improvement since then. 150 years ago, the foremost preachers of our time would have perished at the stake. A universalist would have been torn to pieces in England, Scotland, and America. Unitarians would have found themselves in the stocks, pelted by the rabble with dead cats, after which their ears would have been cut off, and their tongues bored, and their foreheads branded with a bee. Less than 150 years ago, he's writing this in 1870, the following law was in force in Maryland. Be it enacted by the Right Honorable, the Lord Proprietor, by and with the advice of, and so on, that if any person shall hereafter within this province wittingly, maliciously, and advisedly, by writing or speaking, blaspheme or curse God, or deny our Savior Jesus Christ to be the Son of God, or shall deny the Holy Trinity, or shall utter any profane words concerning the Holy Trinity, or any of the persons thereof, shall, for the first offense, be bored through the tongue, and fined 20 pounds to be levied on his body. And for the second offense, the offender shall be stigmatized by burning in the forehead with the letter B, and fined 40 pounds. And that for the third offense, the offender shall suffer death without the benefit of clergy. And Ingersoll notes in 1870 that, strangely, this law was still on the books in Maryland. I hope it's not there anymore. Laws like this were in force in most of the colonies and in all countries where the church had power. In Paine's day, the church was ignorant, bloody, and relentless. In Scotland, the Kirk was at the summit of its power. It was a full sister of the Spanish Inquisition. It waged war upon human nature. It was the enemy of happiness, the hater of joy, and the despiser of religious liberty. It would not allow shipwrecked sailors to be rescued from drowning on Sunday. It sought to annihilate pleasure, to pollute the heart by filling it with religious cruelty and gloom, and to change mankind into a vast horde of pious, heartless fiends. At that time, nothing so delighted the church as the beauties of endless torment and listening to the weak wailings of damned infants struggling in hell. Prosecutions and executions were common in every Christian country, and all of them were based upon the belief that an intellectual conviction is a crime. No wonder the church hated and traduced the author of the Age of Reason. England was filled with Puritan gloom and Episcopal ceremony. All religious conceptions were of the grossest nature. The ideas of crazy fanatics were taken as sober facts. Heaven and hell were realities. The judgment day was expected. Books of account would be opened. Every man would hear the charges read against him. God was supposed to sit on a golden throne surrounded by his tallest angels with harps in their hands. The goats would be thrust into the eternal fire on the left, while the orthodox sheep on the right were to gamble on sunny slopes forever and forever. In Europe, liberty was lying chained in the Inquisition, her white bosom stained with blood. In the New World, the Puritans had been hanging and burning in the name of God and selling white Quaker children into slavery in the name of Christ. Under such conditions, progress was impossible. Someone had to lead the way. The church is and always has been incapable of a forward movement. Someone not connected with the church had to attack the monster that was eating out the heart of the world. Someone had to sacrifice himself for the good of all. Progress is born of doubt and inquiry. Paine struck the first grand blow. The Age of Reason did more to undermine the power of the Protestant church than all other books then known. It furnished immense food for thought. It was written for the average mind. and is a straightforward, honest investigation of the Bible and of the Christian system. Paine did not falter from the first page to the last. The age of reason has liberalized us all. It put arguments in the mouth of the people. It put the church on the defensive. It made the world wise and the church better. It took power from the pulpit and divided it among the pews. Paine denied the authority of Bibles and creeds. This was his crime, and for this the world shut the door in his face. I challenge the world to show that Thomas Paine ever wrote one line, one word in favor of tyranny, in favor of immorality, one line, one word against what he believed to be for the highest and best interest of mankind, one word against justice, charity, or liberty, and yet he has been pursued as though he had been a fiend from hell. His memory has been execrated as though he had murdered. The church has pursued Paine to deter others, but there have been in every age some brave spirits that dared even the gods. Some proud head has always been above the waves. True genius never cowers, and there is always some Samson feeling for the pillars of authority. Speaking of cathedrals, domes, temples, altars, and crowns, he knew that all the pomp and glitter had been purchased with liberty. In looking at the cathedral, he remembered the dungeon. The music of the organ was not loud enough to drown out the clank of fetters. He knew that the cross adorned the hilt of the sword, and so where others worshipped, he wept and scorned. Thomas Paine was one of the intellectual heroes, one of the men to whom we are indebted. His name is associated forever with the great republic. As long as free government exists, he will be remembered, admired, and honored. He lived a long, laborious, and useful life. The world is better for his having lived. For the sake of truth, he accepted hatred and reproach for his portion. He ate the bitter bread of sorrow. His friends were untrue to him because he was true to himself and true to them. He lost the respect of what is called society, but kept his own. At the age of 73, death touched his tired heart. He died in the land his genius defended, under the flag he gave to the skies. Slander cannot touch him now. And Ingersoll quotes again at the close of his lecture from Paine, "Any system of religion that shocks the mind of a child cannot be a true system. The world is my country, and to do good my religion." Paine died in a New York boarding house, pestered at the end by many Christians who came trying to save his soul. Paine turned them all away angrily. I would like now to quote from author Albert Merrin. When Benjamin Franklin died in 1779, more than 20,000 mourners came to the funeral. During Paine's lifetime, he had known hundreds of important people in the United States, England, and France. Not one of them, including Thomas Jefferson, publicly mentioned his passing. Only 5 attended his funeral. Marguerite de Bonneville, a French refugee who had cared for him from time to time, and her son Benjamin, a friend named Willet Hicks, and, quote, 2 Negroes, unquote. He was buried in a field at a corner of his farm alongside the road. Children and others would throw rocks at his tombstone. And local children recited a rhyme, which I think probably was taught to them by adults. Poor Tom Paine, there he lies. Nobody laughs and nobody cries. Where he has gone and how he fares, nobody knows and nobody cares. They care now. Paine has been admired by many. In the 19th century, most notably Abraham Lincoln, who loved Thomas Paine and who said, "I never tire of reading Paine." Mark Twain, Walt Whitman, Thomas Edison were all admirers. He was a great inspiration in the early women's suffrage movement. During World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt quoted Paine to comfort the country during the war. In Thetford, England, Paine's birthplace, there now stands a statue of Paine holding out his quill pen, and I believe one very similar to it stands in Washington, D.C. There are memorials and in 1969, a postage stamp was issued with Paine's likeness and signature on it. Thomas Paine, America's free-thinking founder, remains an inspiration wherever rights and freedom are at stake. Thank you.